Tell me what, in 2008, you saw what was coming. You tried to warn people. Very few people listened to you. What did you see that no one else saw that, let you know what's going on so you could do well even during that time and protect?
Well, we went through the calc. It's really pretty simple. At individual and levels, we went down how much is going to have to be paid back in debt, what are the calculations, who lends the money, and we could see that we were going to have a debt crisis. But
why didn't anybody else see that?
But I want to make it. I did a 30-minute video on how the economic machine
we want people to
works,
see that.
And I'd say if they look at that, almost everything I know that's worthwhile in economics is in that 30-minute video. Yes. And so you can understand, how do you see a bubble? How do you, what are they like? Bubbles and busts and so on. Where are we today in our economic cycle?
That's my question. Where are we today in our economic cycle?
Well, and that's, as you know, there's productivity is one. Productivity. When we learn, we do things better, and we advance our living standards by learning. And that happens at a certain pace.
Yes.
And that's the line. And then around that line, there are two big cycles. There's a short-term debt cycle, which we call a business cycle, right? Yes. You go from a recession to an overheating the economy and so on.
It's over 5 to 8 years usually.
Yeah, so, and it'll stretch. We are, putting the side away, we're at that part of the cycle. We're in the beginning of the late part of the cycle, where no longer do we have the slack, but we're not having tightness. Right. So we're in that part of the cycle, which is the Goldilocks part of the cycle, when things are not too hot and not too cold.
Yes.
And so as a result, we don't have too much inflation, we don't have too much growth, everything is kind of tepid. That's the part of the cycle we're at. Yes. So as a result, the Federal Reserve, which pushed a lot of money into the system, will stop pushing those money into the system. As a result of pushing interest rates down, they're going to stop pushing those interest rates down. And now we're in that transition period, okay? That's the short-term debt cycle. And it's probably not going to produce much volatility. It's going to create that kind of, and almost everything is sort of like at equilibrium. There's short-term interest rates where they are and so on. In addition, though, in the long-term debt cycle, we are late in the long-term debt cycle. The amount
you've got to watch this video because you'll understand this more thoroughly. It's on YouTube. What's the title again? It's
How the Economic Machine Works.
Right. But please continue. I just want to make sure they know to look.
Yeah. Over the period of time, we have accumulated lots of debts, and then some obligations that are not necessarily called hard debts, pension obligations, a lot of pension obligations,
Medicaid,
and then Medicaid and health care. And the demographics are changing, and all of those obligations cannot be met, and they're like a lot of debt, and they're squeezing us. They're going to squeeze us. Okay, so that we're in that middle part of the cycle with that squeezing gradually coming. We don't have a bubble, so we don't have to worry about that. We're going to have a gradual
You're not
squeeze.
worried about another 2008. Here's the question I had.
Here's what I'm worried about.
Please tell me. What are you
we're going to have a squeeze, a slow squeeze, and the biggest thing to understand is that we don't have one economy. Think of it as having two economies, okay? Think of it, to make it this way. There's let's call it the bottom 60% and the top 40%,
yes.
Okay? Because we make a mistake of thinking about the economy or the average economy, and you don't realize how different those are. And that's the biggest issue of our time. So very much like the late 30s, same things, by the way, happened in all of the 30s up to 1937. This year is very similar to 1937.
In what ways?
Back then, they had a debt crisis, 29 to 32. That was the same as our 2008 debt crisis. Mm-hmm. Both cases, interest rates hit zero. In both cases, the central banks printed a lot of money, bought a lot of financial assets, pushed the economy and the market higher and up to 1937, up until now. And then there was a giant wealth gap. So today, the top 1/10% of the population's wealth is equal to the bottom 90% combined.
Mind-boggling.
1/10% equals bottom 90%. You have to go back to 1935 to 1940. And also as a result of that, You have populism.
Yes.
Because one segment the economy's not working for.
Yeah.
Okay, and there's an odds, and we saw it reflected in our election,
Yes.
and we're seeing populism around the world take place.
Yes.
Very similar. And in 1937, we were at the exact same point in the cycle, and the Federal Reserve decided to tighten monetary policy, and as a result, we had a 50% fall in the stock market. We had a lot of problems. We don't have to enact that. There are lessons to be learned from that period of time. I think the Fed is...
You talk about a soft landing, so
in other words, we don't want to... You can't have an economic downturn, right? Even though times are supposedly great for the average. The stock price is at new highs. We have a situation in where the unemployment rate is low. If you look at the circumstances of that bottom 60%, the economy has not worked. They haven't had growth.
That's right.
Their death rates are rising at only places in the world. They're rising because of opiates and because of suicides.
Yeah.
The employment, that middle part of the economy is having a hollowing out. So if you just said, what does that economy, let's carve it out and look at that economy, and that's the economy that we have, that is a miserable economy.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a miserable economy.
Yeah.
So the fact that we have these two economies, think of it as two economies operating at the same time.
By the way, what are the economics of the bottom 60% versus the upper 40? Or how are you dividing it up? What's the economic barrier there? What's the number, I guess? What are you saying an income stream is that for a person? Who's in that bottom 60% or 40%, however you're chunking it?
It's 50 some odd thousand or
below.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
But if you can't have that conflict.
Yeah.
So if we look at averages, we're in a bind, right?
Yeah.
So the central bank. So these are the economic issues. I think the most important is how we deal with conflict. Okay, conflict of the haves and have-nots, conflict of the left and the right, conflict